What Deb asked me to do is kind of talk about the role of elders in the church, and specifically how churches in the Stone-Campbell movement, and specifically disciple churches, interpret the role of elders. Now, one thing that I've always said is true of disciples: if you get 6 disciples in a room, you're going to have 8 opinions. And you'll find that around the role of elders, and the practice around elders can vary dramatically from congregation to congregation. So we're just going to kind of walk through some of that and kind of land in on what the role of elders is, and you're going to get 6 disciples, 8 opinions. 2 of them are going to be opinion of Dean. So you're going to get a lot of my thoughts on it, but that's where I welcome some conversation and hear your thoughts on this as well. So we are a people of the book, and so we'll start kind of how the role appears in the New Testament. The word elder, the Greek word behind it is presbuteros. And if you're detecting a similarity to the word Presbyterian, you're right on track. Actually, our English word priest also gets its derivation from this as well. So there's three uses of this word in the New Testament, and it is pretty consistently translated elder where you see it. One is that it just refers to an older person. So when you're looking at the first couple of verses of 1 Timothy 5, the counsel there to that young minister is to not speak harshly to an elder. Don't speak harshly to an older person, or don't rebuke an elder harshly. And it's just referring to an older person in that context, I think. We're going to dance later into 1 Timothy 5, and it gets used in a different sense. Luke 15. Luke 15 is where the story of the prodigal is. And so when the prodigal returns home, there is another son in the field. Well, it's the elder son. It's the one that's older. So it just has that comparative context to it. Deb is my elder. And I try not to rebuke my elders. Certainly not harshly. It's also used to refer to ancestors, those who have gone before. So Hebrews 11 is really a sermon to a church of Jewish believers, and it talks about the faith of our ancestors, the faith of our elders. That's another use for the word. In Matthew 15:2. Jesus' table manners always got him in trouble. And in one case, the disciples sat down to dinner and they didn't wash their hands first. And the rebuke is, why do your disciples not keep the tradition of the elders? This that has been passed on to us from generation to generation. And it also has that connotation of an official. So if you get outside of the New Testament context and look at some other historical documents, you'll see council members in local communities referred to as presbuteros, as elders. So these are officials. These are our leaders within a community. And the church adopted that as well. Find my way back to 1 Timothy here. And so in that same chapter, 1 Timothy again is the one that has the 1 in front of it. So where it starts, the first verse says, do not speak harshly to an older man. Well, it's the same elder word that's sitting behind that. He goes on to talk about elders as being leaders or officials in the context of this community of faith, in this church. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. So there's a sense of some ruling, some being an official in there, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Never accept any accusation against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So, in that early day of the church, you also see the church adopting this sense of an elder as an official, as a leader, as somebody that's looked up to in the community and has some role, some degree of authority in the community as well. So elders as officials, again, in Acts, we see in the Jerusalem church, and in the early days, whether the church at Jerusalem is a synagogue or a church is really kind of back and forth. You could really use, it's a community of Jewish believers who are followers of Jesus, who are followers of the way. But there was a famine, and you'll read through many of Paul's letters talk about an offering for the church at Jerusalem, where there was a famine in Judea. And so these Gentile churches were encouraged to send an offering to Jerusalem to assist, kind of a relief offering, sort of week of compassion in the first century church. And the offering for that famine was delivered to the elders. So these are officials. These are people that have some degree, some kind of responsibility in the church. When the church hits its first major crisis, and I use the word crisis very deliberately, a crisis is a decision point. It's a place where we have to go one place or the other. I think the word crisis has kind of fallen into real overuse today. I get people to buy my paper by putting crisis on the front page. Crisis is really a decision point. It's a place where we have to go one way or the other. And really the first major crisis that the church hit was, what do we do with these Gentile believers? They weren't Jews first. Specifically, they'd not been circumcised. So what do we have to do here? And Paul and Barnabas are out among these churches, bringing people to follow the way of Jesus, all over. And there are actually people now coming into these churches and going, hey, wait a minute, hold the phone. If you're going to call yourselves Christians, you need to be good Jews first and get circumcised. So it's creating all this confusion and disorder. So we need to have really what I refer to as the first General Assembly. We need to have, we call together a council, and Paul and Barnabas and some others make the trip to Jerusalem. And throughout Acts 15, you'll hear the group referred to as the elders and apostles. So the elders aren't necessarily the apostles that were with Jesus. But it's this group, the elders and apostles, that are called on to deal with this first crisis, to come to some kind of place of making a decision. And as you read through the chapter, the elders and apostles do three things. First, they listen. They listened to Paul and Barnabas explain this. They listened to others. They heard as much of the story as they could. And then the story the text seems to indicate that they sort of went off by themselves then. They discussed among themselves, what should we do? And they came to the conclusion that no, these Gentile believers, there's kind of a compromise position reached. No, these Gentile believers do not need to be circumcised first, but we do ask them to abstain from eating meat that still has blood in it. So a couple of the dietary restrictions are still in there. But we reach this compromise position. The elders and apostles discuss among themselves and come up with, this is what we should do. And then the last thing they do is they communicate that decision. So they come out and they talk to those assembled, to Paul and Barnabas, and they say, okay, your job now is to go back out and communicate to the churches what this decision is. They listened, they discussed, and then they communicated. And this is the elders and apostles in that very early first century church. So in the local church, we have roles for elders. In fact, you kind of see leading into that Acts 14, I refer to this as the disciple model for starting churches. What they did, and this is at Antioch, the conclusion of chapter 14 says that They appointed elders for them there. They started the church. There were many converted to the way. They trained them, they taught them, then they appointed elders and went on their way. So the work of the church, the ministry of the church, was really left in the hands of those who were there, who had been converted. It was left in the hands of the local folks. And this was exactly the Walter Scott method of starting churches in the early days of the Stone-Campbell movement. What Walter Scott would do is he would go into a community. He would announce an evangelistic meeting on the steps of the courthouse. He would go to the schoolyards and tell the students, tell your parents to come to such and such a place tonight. I'm going to preach on my 5 fingers, and give them what we now know as the 5-finger exercise. And then, once the church is established, we have some leaders. It's kind of clear who emerges in this role of elder. Then work of the church, the ministry of the church, is left in the hands of those people, and Scott goes off and does the same thing again in another community until he finally lands in Mays Lick, Kentucky, where he serves what's now the First Christian Church of Mays Lick, and both his ministry and his life end there. He's buried at Mays Lick. Now, in the early church, this really became a hierarchy. It was really clear what the pecking order was. And if you saw a procession, it was really clear what the pecking order was. There were first bishops, and then elders, and then deacons. Very, very clear what that pecking order was. And all 3 of these terms in the early church were used to refer to ordained or set-apart clergy persons. So, and that's still true in Episcopal traditions today. So in the Roman Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church or the United Methodist Church, you still have bishops and elders and deacons. In the United Methodist Church, your ordination first starts with receiving your deacon's orders. You're ordained as a deacon. If you've ever seen somebody in their robe and their stole is draped across them sideways, that means they've been ordained as a deacon. They've received deacon's orders. Then one would receive elder's orders and be ordained as an elder. That's when you get to put your stole on right. And then one might be elected and consecrated as a bishop. So it's very clear that there's this kind of moving up, there's this hierarchy, there's this pecking order, and the terms bishop, elder, and deacon always refer to ordained clergy.
So in the disciples' tradition, when did they not, or did they decide not to adopt the bishop?
We have always been allergic to the term bishop.
Yeah.
We're a church that believes, the founders believed in Bible names for Bible things. Part of what we were rebelling against or resisting, though, was some of the ways that a bishop's authority was used. So bishops would construct some of these human-made things to decide who was really Christian and who really wasn't. And so we've always been allergic to the term bishop. In fact, there are some disciple clergy that have been consecrated as bishops by their local congregation or by some other body. And we tend to look out the corner of our eyes at it. We're still a little bit suspicious of the term.
So
bishop.
if in the disciples' tradition, what is our equivalent of the bishop? Is it what you're going to be doing, or is it what the general secretary does, or?
Excuse me, when we restructured the church in 1968, you'll get a little flavor of my cynicism here. We were coming out of a time when we really felt like we could organize the kingdom of God. And we thought there would be this great denominational merger. Now, there's always been, the disciples in early days organized ourselves as mission societies or mission associations. And there would often be a state secretary. When we restructured the church in 1968, that role evolved into what's called a regional minister. And so on the outside appearance, it looks like we have a bishop and some clergy and local congregations. Now, what I say about being a regional minister is I have all of the responsibility of a bishop and none of the authority. Really and truly, I think of myself as being an elder in every congregation. So, to swing back around, we are in the Stone-Campbell movement. You know, the founders were very much about Bible names for Bible things. The New Testament is our only sure guide in matters of faith and practice. And so we would look at these roles of elders and deacons and see them not as ordained, necessarily clergy roles, not as professional clergy roles, but as roles for the laity, for the people. The pastor is, again, this is ecclesiology of dean, my understanding of the church. The pastor is an elder alongside the other elders in the church. That's why I describe my approach to regional ministry is I'm an elder in each of these congregations. If a church is in trouble, if a church calls in the regional minister, the first group I want to meet with is the elders. Again, there's that word. It's not a hierarchy, but it's different roles and callings. And it even gets a paragraph in the design. The design for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is kind of the governing document for the denomination. And paragraph 88 is to talk about this. The offices of elder and deacon are ordered by the congregations. Still very much congregational. It's about congregational autonomy. Congregations order elders and deacons. Through election and recognition with appropriate ceremony for the performance of certain functions of ministry. These are ministry positions. I lament sometimes when I see that roles of elders and deacons have almost become ornamental. But these are ministry functions. A person elected elder is authorized to exercise within the congregation which elects her or him the ministerial functions it assigns for periods of time which it specifies, such as sharing in the administration of baptism and the Lord's Supper, so the sacraments, elders, the conduct of worship, sharing in the pastoral care and spiritual leadership of the congregation. The eldership is a voluntary ministry. It's not a professional ministry. Each congregation having a plurality of elders, meaning you should have more than one. And this is all the design says about it. Here's our understanding of what an elder is. But I think one of the key phrases in there is that first sentence: the offices of elder and deacon are ordered by the congregations. So each congregation is going to define in its own governing documents, whether that's a constitution or bylaws, this is what being an elder means to us. Some even saying this is how many we think we need. So in the local congregation, the most visible role for elders is during worship at communion. That's the time when you really see the elders in ministry. And so as we're serving the service of communion, the minister or another elder will tell the story. That's what the words of institution are all about. I received from the Lord what I also pass on to you, that our Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed. I heard this story, and I'm telling it to you. And we tell it every time we get together for worship. The elder also consecrates the elements. The elder does the prayer at the table. And that's largely what this is about. The elder's prayer is calling us back to why we're doing what we're doing. In inviting, I have trouble using words like inviting God into our midst because, sorry, God's here anyway. But calling our attention to that presence. Calling our attention to, this is more than just a little bit of bread and a little cup of juice. This means more to us. And that's part of what the elder's prayer at the table does. And then the deacons have responsibility for distributing the element of the elements of it. They have a ministry service. These are all ministry positions. But if you look at what disciples, elders do at the table, it's really the role that's reserved for ordained clergy in other faith traditions. You know, as a United Methodist, I could not, as a layperson, get up and consecrate the elements. In the days of the circuit riding preacher, you could only have communion if the ordained minister showed up. Catholic Church the same way, and then even the limitations on who can receive as well. So we've given that role, that ministry role, that responsibility to laypersons. We are very much about the ministry or the priesthood of all believers. When you came up out of the waters of baptism, you were called to ministry. And service as an elder is one of those ministries that you would be called to. So the ministry of elders, like I said, I really see the elders and the pastor being in ministry together. When I was serving as a local church pastor, I relied very heavily on my elders. I asked for counsel from my elders a lot. If there were some conflict, some situation in the church. Matter of fact, there was one time in one church where I was serving that some things were being said about me that just flat out were not true. And the group that I called together to talk about it was the elders. Just to say, here's what I've heard is being said. Have you heard this? And we had a very good, rich discussion about it. And the elders were the ones ultimately that decided what we should do, how we should approach this, what we should communicate. So the elders and pastor are very much a partner in ministry together. So they share responsibilities for worship. They share responsibilities for pastoral care. There's a passage in the book of James. I wouldn't be a good Lutheran because I love James too much. Are any among you sick? Let them call for the elders of the church to pray for them and anoint them with oil. So there's that sense of elders being called to a ministry of pastoral care as well. It is not unusual that elders would be called upon to preach, to exhort the congregation. Certainly elders as teachers. And there's a role for elders in administration and providing guidance. The word that we use, again, I'm going to fall back to the Greek. When we read about administration, we're really talking about the person that sits at the back of the boat and holds the rudder. They offer guidance. And I love the model that was given to us in Acts 15. Listen, discuss, communicate. So elders very much do their ministry as a team together. It's the group of elders. It's the body of elders that do this ministry. It's not good to have solo elders who kind of go off and do their own thing. It's good that the elders are working together as a group.
May I interject too? Just I think also recognition of the various gifts of each other. So some of you are saying, oh my gosh, if I were called to preach, I'd just die right there. But that's something we ask, is this something you'd ever be comfortable doing, like Mary Henderson did?
Thank you. I actually meant to say that I would not say that every elder does all of these. But there are specific areas here where different people are gifted. Do you have a primary area here and a secondary area here? So not that every elder does the same thing, but that we understand the ministry in this context.
I was going to say, when Lynn Doyne's funeral and Bert Doyne, his family all ran off and left him here before the service, and he was just sitting there. And Janice Pirat was there, and we asked, I just said, can you go in there and be with him? And she was there and talked with him and listened. And very much that's the thing that you want to be able to ask an elder to do. I think that's something that all of us, may not feel comfortable so much about, but you never know when something like that's going to happen, not just at church, but at work. And that's something that we'll work on in our training, is just some hints to help times like that.
And Joe Jones was the president of Phillips University. What was his role? Was he was the dean at CTS, or was he president there as well? Anyway, Joe, when we were in Oklahoma, Joe and I became friends, and I found a lecture that he had done several years ago, and I think his definition, his understanding of who the disciples are, is really good. And I think really part of the role of elders is to really have a focused effort to live out some of these things. So we're a biblical people. Our faith is informed by Scripture. We are people of the book, sometimes to a fault. We're a spiritual people. We do seek empowerment and inspiration from the Holy Spirit. And how we find that, wow, how many different ways might we go about that? I think that happens in community better than anywhere else. We're a reasonable people. We think it's important to bring our faith into conversation with reason. We've been accused of being head people, not heart people. That oversimplifies it. But we're definitely a people of reason. We're a thinking people. I think you heard Mary say that one of the things that attracted her to the disciples was she didn't have to check her brain at the door. That's true for me as well. That was very attractive to me. We're an ecumenical people. So we've been, the ecumenical movement of the 20th century that I talked about, we were very much at the forefront of that. We have always been very active at giving leadership to organizations like the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. We're committed to the unity of the church. And for me, that frames up in, what the founders of the movement would say: we're not the only Christians, we're Christians only. And to understand that about all Christians. It's not an exclusive group. It's not our job to try to figure out who's in and who's out, but to recognize the faith and the baptism and the belonging of every believer. That's what I mean when I talk about ecumenical. And we're also an evangelistic people. We're people who give witness to our faith in how we live, how we speak. Evangelism is a word that gets misinterpreted a lot. We're not talking about walking people up the side of the head with the Bible. We're not sitting down with folks and walking them down the Romans road. But it's giving witness to our faith. Having an understanding of what we believe so that we can engage in dialogue and in conversation about it and let it inform the decisions that we make. I think I made it to the end of my slides by 10:30.
Yeah.
Between that, yeah.
That was good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.